A child falls into a coma and returns with a revelation that's impossible to ignore. What she said when she woke up exposed a family secret buried for more than 30 years, a secret no one dared mention. In this video, you will learn about one of the most impactful accounts of a near-death experience, NDE, ever recorded, where the supernatural meets faith and divine truth comes to light through a simple answered prayer. Get ready for a story that will touch your soul, challenge your understanding of life, and show that God reveals the hidden when you least expect it. Alexander was just 8 years old, an ordinary boy in everyone's eyes, but extraordinary in his mother's eyes. He was the curious, observant type, one of those who seemed to have a greater sensitivity than his age allows. They lived in a small rural town in Texas, where everyone knew everyone and time seemed to pass slowly. The family's life was simple but full of faith. Every night before going to sleep, Alexander prayed with his mother, short, sincere words, a pure heart, surrendered. That morning, the sun shone brightly over the roof of the elementary school. It was a day of playing in the courtyard, running around, laughing, but all it took was a second, a distraction, a false step. He tripped over the side of the slide and fell badly, hitting his head hard on the concrete. The noise attracted teachers and students, and within minutes the ambulance arrived. The mother, upon receiving the call, ran without thinking, barefoot, leaving the kettle on the stove and her heart in her mouth. At the hospital, the doctors were clear. The impact caused head trauma. He fell into a coma within the first few hours. The image of Alexander intubated, motionless, with wires coming out of his head and chest, seemed like a nightmare. But it was real. The hospital room, white and silent, became that mother's new altar. It was there that she prayed, kneeling on the cold floor, with her eyes red and her lips murmuring verses of faith. How many times have you felt like everything was in God's hands? That control slipped from your fingers and only heaven could intervene. She felt it, and it was as if every second of assisted breathing was a reminder that there was something bigger going on. The following days were slow. Doctors said the situation was stable, but the risk still existed. Alexander didn't react. No movement. No sign that he would hear his mother's voice calling softly at the bedside. She sang hymns. He played praises at low volume on his cell phone. Sometimes I read the Bible to him, hoping that the word would penetrate where no one else could reach. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. It was the verse she repeated with a trembling voice every day. The father, more silent, sat in the armchair in the corner, with his eyes fixed on his son and his heart crushed by impotence. Sometimes he would leave the room to cry in secret, so as not to break down in front of his wife. The pain was great, but the silence was even greater. Grandma came every day. He took a white rose, placed it in the corner of the window and said, "Flowers speak to God. They don't need words." And he left it there like someone sowing faith. In the city, news of the accident spread quickly. The church the family attended organized prayer vigils. Brothers took turns fasting. Alexander's name came to be pronounced in many homes. Heaven was being triggered, and that in itself was already a miracle. Because when the body stops, the spirit keeps moving, and when doctors are silent, God still speaks. What no one knew was that, in that comatose silence, something was happening. On the outside, he just looked like a sleeping boy. Inside, no one could imagine. But that part is yet to be told, and you need to be prepared for what will come. For now, the focus is here. At a moment when everything seemed lost, a spark of life rekindled in Alexander's eyes. It was the morning of the third day. The mother no longer knew if it was Sunday or Monday. Time had lost its name. She held her son's hand and whispered a prayer. Suddenly, he felt a slight movement in his fingers. He thought it was his imagination, but it wasn't. His eyelid fluttered, and then he opened his eyes. Alexander's eyes, the same ones she kissed every night before going to sleep. They were open, firm, fixed on her. There was no confusion, no fear, no pain. There was peace, a deep, inexplicable peace. The mother called the nurses, screamed, cried, smiled, all at the same time. The room filled up. The father ran in. The grandmother fell to her knees in the corner and began to pray out loud. But Alexander, with all the calm in the world, as if he had just returned from a walk, looked at everyone and said in a soft voice, "Mommy, why didn't you ever tell me about the man with the black collar?" The world stopped. The room fell silent. The father turned pale. The grandmother covered her mouth with her hand. And the mother. The mother just cried, not out of relief, but from shock. That question didn't make sense. Alexander had no way of knowing this. It was impossible, unbelievable. That belonged to a forgotten chapter in the family's history, a past that everyone decided to bury, a name that no one mentioned, a symbol, the black necklace, that had been stored for decades, along with the pain that no one had the courage to revisit. "What do you mean, son?" she asked, still out of breath. "He showed me," Alexander replied with calm eyes, as if he had something that needed to be said. At that moment, the mother knew that something much greater than any human understanding had happened, but she still couldn't understand. He still didn't know what he saw. I still didn't know what he experienced. All he knew was that his son was no longer the same, and that maybe she wasn't anymore either. If stories like this make your heart race, if you feel that there is something greater revealing itself through each word, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because here each story is more than an experience. It is a sign that God still speaks, still heals, and still transforms lives. Alexander's gaze remained still, serene, but there was something in it, something different. It was as if behind the childish sweetness, there was now a knowledge that could not be contained in simple words. He didn't say much that first day. I watched, I listened, and when he spoke, his sentences came with pauses, as if he needed to search within himself for the translation of something that did not belong to this world. But as the hours passed, he began to count, little by little, like someone who doesn't want to scare, but knows they need to share, like someone carrying a mission. He said that at the moment of the fall, everything went dark very quickly, but he felt no fear. It was as if I had taken a heavy backpack off my back. Very light, Mum, very light. That's how he described it. An indescribable lightness. And then, like a breath, came the sensation of being outside. Outside the body, outside the room, out of the pain. He floated. His words were simple, but the sparkle in his eyes said more than any sentence. I saw you, Mummy. You were holding my hand, crying softly, but I was there, close, very close. Alexander said he could see everything from above. The hospital room seemed smaller, and at the same time, fuller. He described his father's exact position in the chair. He said that his grandmother was kneeling, and that she had a white handkerchief in her hand, something that until then no one had mentioned in front of him. He said he heard the prayers, but not how we normally hear it. It was as if each word had a color, a light, a melody. Each mother's sentence formed a chain of brilliance that rose and rose until it disappeared into the ceiling of the room. He couldn't say how long he stayed like that, floating. Time seemed to not exist. It was as if everything was still but alive, he said. At that moment, something changed. He was no longer just observing the room. A presence appeared. He couldn't say whether it was walking, flying, or simply appearing, but I knew that presence was good. He was made of light, but it didn't hurt to look at. His light was warm, like a hug. Alexander used this word several times. Hug. He repeated that everything there seemed to be made of hugs. Nothing weighed, nothing hurt. Everything made sense, even without needing to understand it. When he described this luminous presence, he made a point of saying that it was not an angel with wings like in the drawings, but there was something in her eyes, something that made him trust. He knew my name without me saying it, and he called me in the calmest voice I've ever heard. He said, "This man of light," as he called him, did not speak with his mouth. It was with the thought, with the heart. It was as if the soul responded before the question finished. They were no longer in the hospital. The environment had changed. Alexander described it as passing through a kind of veil made of wind, something invisible, but that could be felt on the skin. And then everything became clearer. A field, an immensity of soft light, trees that seemed alive inside, colors that don't exist here, a sound that was silence, but at the same time music. It was difficult for him to explain. He said he tried to remember, but not all the words existed. It's like trying to draw the wind, he said, smiling. But even without fully understanding it, he knew that place was special. And more than that, it was true. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't imagination. It was real as the mother's touch, as the smell of the room, as the pain of the fall. There, next to the man of light, he began to see things. I didn't know if they were memories, visions, or parts of a larger story, but they were scenes, vivid images that unfolded before him as if he were watching life through a window in the sky. Some scenes he recognized, others, no, some looked old, others looked familiar, but everything had a connection, everything had a purpose, and there was a constant feeling in his chest through it all, peace, not that peace that we try to achieve with meditation or rest, but a living peace, palpable, an absolute certainty that I was where I was supposed to be, and that, even without understanding everything, I was being taken care of, guided. The boy tried to tell, with all the limitations of human language, that something had been shown to him, something that, at that moment, he still didn't know how to explain. But I knew it was important, and that needed to be remembered, as if someone had written a mission on his heart, as if his soul had returned with a note hidden between his ribs, something that would still come to light at the right time. He also spoke of a bridge that connected this field of light to another place. He didn't cross, but you saw, and when he tried to get closer, he heard a voice, the same as the man of light, saying, "It's not time yet, you need to go back." And in that moment, Alexander felt something he had never felt before. It wasn't fear, it was longing, missing a place he only knew for a few moments, missing something that felt like true home. The mother listened to all this with her eyes full of tears. Dad squeezed his hand, trying to stay steady. The room, previously full of machines and noises, now seemed different, because there was a different atmosphere there. Something had been touched, something had been opened, but Alexander still hadn't told everything. This was just the first part, the beginning of a much bigger story, because from that moment on, the memories of what he saw began to come in fragments, details, words, sensations, and little by little he would begin to reveal what was hidden, things he could never know for himself. But that would still be told. The days following Alexander's awakening were strange, not in the negative sense, but there was a different kind of silence hanging over the family home. It was as if everyone who witnessed his return was trying to understand not only what had happened, but what it meant, because one thing was certain, he didn't come back the same. There was a calmness in him, a depth in his eyes, as if he carried something that no longer fit inside the small body of an 8-year-old child, something he hadn't said yet, but that seemed to pulse inside, wanting to come out. The mother watched everything carefully. She tried to maintain the routine, offer meals, talk like before, but something inside her said that that temporary silence was just preparation for something much bigger. She felt it, as a mother, as a woman of faith, as someone who had already seen the supernatural up close, even without being able to explain it. And she was right. On the evening of the 3rd day after his release from the hospital, Alexander was sitting at the kitchen table with a sketchbook and some colored pencils. He didn't say much, but he scribbled with concentration. Suddenly he stopped, looked at his mother and asked, as naturally as asking for a glass of milk, "Mommy, what happened to the man with the black collar?" She froze. He took a deep breath, trying not to show shock. "What man, son?" "You know, the one who left the black necklace on top of the Bible. He cried at night. He was afraid of a secret. But he's not bad, Mom. He was just scared." That sentence was like a bolt of lightning splitting the ground beneath her. The black necklace, the Bible, the hidden cry. None of this information was ever told to Alexander. Not in close conversations, not in photos, not in any other situation that could justify that. It was impossible. And yet, there he was, the son, saying phrases that they brought to light a past that had been carefully buried for more than 30 years. She sat down slowly, like someone losing strength in their legs. Her gaze met her husband's, who entered the kitchen seconds later. He heard part of the conversation, and his expression completely changed. He knew that story, and for the first time in years, the forgotten name fell from his lips. Matteo. Alexander nodded. Yes, himself. Matteo. But he told me he's not mad. He just wanted Mom to know that she was forgiven, and that the secret doesn't need to stay hidden anymore. The grandmother, who came from the living room with a cup of tea in her hands, almost dropped it on the floor. She stopped, frozen, looking at her grandson like someone seeing a ghost. The name said echoed like an open wound. Matteo had been a distant cousin, but very close emotionally. He was young, full of dreams, and got involved with Alexander's mother before she met his father. A hidden romance interrupted by painful circumstances, an unacknowledged pregnancy, a child who was never born, a guilt that was never healed. And then, the disappearance. Matteo disappeared mysteriously, and although there were rumors, no one ever confirmed what had happened to him. The pain and shame were silenced. The family decided to erase this chapter from history, until that moment. But Alexander continued, as if he was just repeating what needed to be said. He showed me the place where you last talked. There was a wooden bench and a field, and you were crying, Mom. You were crying a lot. He said he never forgot that day, but now everything is fine. And that, you need to tell the truth, because the truth sets you free. That last word fell like a whisper from heaven. Free. The mother couldn't take it. Tears fell uncontrollably. Her father quietly sat next to her and held her hand. The grandmother approached her grandson and hugged him, as if embracing the memory of what was left behind, and no one said a word, because nobody needed it. What had just been revealed was more than words. It was proof that the human spirit carries marks that neither time nor silence can erase, and that God, at the right time, uses even little ones to open windows to the truth. The most impactful thing was understanding how Alexander spoke. No drama, no flourishes, just sincerely, as if he wasn't trying to prove anything, just fulfill something that was entrusted to you, and at that moment, even the most skeptical felt it. This was real. It was impossible for an 8-year-old child who had never heard about Matteo to know about the existence of the necklace, the bench, the field, the unspoken words, the forgiveness never achieved. The only possible explanation was one that logic cannot reach, but that faith understands. God had allowed Alexander to see. That he knew. That brought back what needed to be said. The family, at that moment, understood. The 31-year-old secret could no longer be kept. It was time to heal. It was time to expose to the light what had lived in the shadows for so long, but not because someone told me to. And yes, because heaven had touched earth through a child who slept and came back different. Still, Alexander seemed to keep more, as if the revelation was just part of what he needed to share. And as the days passed, other things began to emerge. Fragments, scenes, names, but everything in his time. Never before, never after. Always with the calm of someone who fully trusts what they carry inside. When God touches through a child, it's not just a story, it's a calling. The truth frees, heals, and transforms. Comment here in the comments, I believe that the truth sets you free. Your words are part of this chain of faith and hope that reaches lives. The silence that took over the kitchen that night was not just any silence. It was dense, it was loaded. It was as if each breath was measured, as if the air had become too heavy to move in and out of the lungs. The name Matteo, spoken by Alexander so naturally, had not only exposed an ancient secret, it had opened a forgotten wound. And now there, face to face with a child who could never have known about that man's existence, everyone knew. The truth was alive, and it pulsed between them as if it had never been buried. Grandma was the first to break the silence. She approached Alexander's mother, held her hands and said in a choked voice, "You need to tell, my daughter. You need to tell." But the mother couldn't speak. The words caught in his throat. She looked at her son with teary eyes, trying to understand how this was possible, trying to understand how an 8-year-old boy, just out of a coma, could describe in detail something that not even adults had the courage to remember. The father, who until then had remained firm with a restrained expression, lowered his head. He passed his hand over his face, took a deep breath, and for the first time in many years, let a tear fall. This was more than a revelation. It was confrontation. It was as if time had been forced back, as if the past had invaded the present with a spiritual force that no one could hold back, a break between what was hidden and what needed, finally, to be released. And then, the truth began to take shape. The grandmother sat next to her grandson, holding one of his hands gently as if touching something sacred, and he started talking. He didn't look directly at anyone. He spoke to the air like someone bringing out something that had been suffocated for a long time. She said that Matteo was Alexander's mother's cousin, a young man who had come to live with them when he was still a teenager, after losing his parents in an accident. They grew up together, they lived like brothers, but over time the bond transformed. Affection turned into passion, a forbidden, hidden love, full of guilt and desire. And then, one day, Matteo just left. He left a letter. He said he needed to disappear, that he couldn't hide it any longer, that he didn't want to disturb his family, that he had done something unforgivable. That letter was never shown to anyone. Only the grandmother knew. She had kept it hidden, thinking it would protect her daughter. But there, in front of her grandson, in front of the spirit that had clearly manifested itself, she understood that the time of silence was over. "I thought I was protecting you, but now I see I was just delaying the healing." Alexander's mother was crying. He couldn't contain the turmoil inside him. She remembered that love, from that summer, that abrupt goodbye. But he had buried everything, put everything in a mental box and locked it with several keys. He never brought up the subject again, not even with his mother, not even with her husband, not even with God. And now here, watching her own son repeat words that Matteo used to say when the two of them were hidden in the afternoon on a wooden bench behind his grandmother's house, she knew there was no denying it. It was real. Alexander wasn't making it up. He couldn't make it up. He told me he left the black necklace for me, that he placed on top of the open Bible, in Psalm 91, but you never let me take it. I didn't understand. He wanted it to be mine. Alexander said this looking at his grandmother, with sweetness and simplicity. And then, as if pulled by a force that didn't come from her, the grandmother got up, left the room, and returned a few minutes later with a small wooden box. She was shaking. The hands hesitated, but the heart pushed. He opened the box in silence. Inside, a necklace with black beads and a round pendant worn by time, and next to it, folded carefully, the letter. That same letter that she never had the courage to reread. He placed the box on the table. Alexander's mother put her hands over her mouth. That existed. It was still there. And the boy. He described everything exactly as it was, without ever having seen it, without ever having heard. The truth was before them. It was no longer a secret. It was a calling. Alexander's father was silent for a long time, and then he said, "I don't know what's going on, but I know this isn't coming from a common place. This is spiritual. This is bigger than us. This is God revealing what needs to be healed." And perhaps it was this phrase that paved the way for something even deeper. Because from that moment on, there was no more resistance. There was no more hiding it. It was as if everyone knew that this moment was sacred. And even though the pain of the past hurt, there was also a relief, a strange kind of peace that came with the exposure. As if finally the pieces were returning to their places, Alexander watched everything in silence, as if he was just waiting for that to happen, as if he had just been the messenger, the instrument chosen by God to restore what was broken. The mother knelt before him. He looked into his son's eyes with his soul exposed and said, "You have no idea what you just did, my love, but one day you will understand. You are being used for something much bigger, and I love you, for everything, for this." And there on that kitchen floor, 3 generations embraced. I cry, relief, gratitude, and one certainty. The sky had touched that house, unexpectedly, in a simple way, but with the force of thunder. Time, in that house, started to have a different rhythm. After that intense night, after the revelation that exploded the family's emotional structures, it was as if a new cycle had begun, but no one knew for sure what would come next. The days seemed suspended between what had been experienced and what still needed to be revealed. There was a collective feeling of waiting, as if everyone felt, without needing to speak, that Alexander hadn't said everything yet. And in a suit, there wasn't one. He continued with that firm and calm look. There was no rush to his words. He seemed to know that everything had its time, and the next hour was coming. It was a cloudy afternoon. The light coming in through the window created a calm atmosphere in the room. The mother was washing dishes in silence. The father was reading a verse from the Bible on the couch, and the grandmother was crocheting with her eyes lost in memories of the past. Alexander entered the room, sketchbook in hand. He sat down on the floor right in the middle among everyone and began to speak with the naturalness of someone who says he dreamed of a field of flowers. "I need to tell you one more thing," he said, and at that moment the air seemed to stop circulating. All eyes turned to him. "When I was there, in that beautiful place, where everything had color and sound at the same time, they told me that I needed to tell what I saw because if I didn't tell it, someone wouldn't be freed." Mom dropped the sponge in the sink. The father closed the Bible without realizing it. The grandmother lowered her head and squeezed the ball of yarn tightly. Alexander continued. They weren't angry, they were calm, as if they already knew I would come back, and they said that was just my mission, to tell so that the truth would free someone who is still trapped inside. Nobody interrupted him. The words came so lightly, but at the same time with so much spiritual strength that it was impossible not to feel the presence of something much greater in that room. And although it was a child speaking, his voice seemed carried with an ancient ancestral weight, as if it echoed beyond time. I didn't understand at the time what freeing was, but now I think that's what happened to Mom. She was trapped inside, and now she's lighter. They said that when we hide the pain, it becomes an invisible chain, and when we tell it, it breaks. The mother cried without making a sound. The tears flowed, hot, as if washing away years of silence. The boy then added, they said that telling the truth is a mission, and that God chooses who will be used, even if it is a child. They told me that there are more people like that, trapped inside, and that I was going to help, just by telling them. The phrase remained in the air like a wind that comes through the window and shivers the skin without asking for permission. This wasn't just a report. It was a spiritual message, a divine reminder that God uses little people for big things, and that even without understanding everything, when He sends a mission, it is because there is a purpose behind it, a plan, an intention that goes beyond what human eyes can see. The grandmother slowly got up, went to her grandson, and hugged him. They stayed like that in silence for a few seconds. His father approached and placed his hand on his head. Then he said, "Son, if this is your mission, we will be with you, always." His mother sat on the floor next to him, still unable to stop crying, but it was no longer a cry of pain. It was another kind of tear, as if, in that moment, she was being touched by something that could not be explained, only felt. "Do you know who these people were who told you that?" she asked, her voice low. Alexander thought for a few seconds, looked up as if searching for a distant memory, and replied, "I don't know the names, but they knew mine. And they called me as if they had known me since before I was born." This answer made the grandmother squint her eyes, as if searching within herself for a very old memory. The father looked at the closed Bible and placed his hand on it, without saying anything. And the mother, for the first time, smiled. The spiritual presence in that room was palpable. It was as if the atmosphere had been invaded by something invisible and at the same time absolutely real. The peace was so dense that it seemed to have smell, shape, volume. Alexander said nothing more that day. He went back to his notebook and started drawing. Simple lines, colorful strokes, shapes that only he understood. But everyone knew. He had received something, a responsibility that he did not choose, but that he accepted with the pure heart of a child who trusts in everything that comes from God. And in a way, everyone there was also summoned. Because once you hear something like that, it's impossible to continue living the same way. The grandmother began to pray every day for her grandson's mission. The father began to write down every word Alexander said. And Mom finally found peace in forgiveness. Because, as he himself said, telling freed us. But there was more to come. Because when God speaks, He doesn't stop at the first sentence. He continues, reveal, direct, cure. The days following the revelation were silent, but it was a different silence from the one that reigned before. It was no longer the silence of fear, of the unspoken, of the suffocating secret that hovered invisibly over the rooms of the house. Now it was an absorbed silence. From those who are still digesting the impact of something much bigger than they imagined, it was the silence of the sacred. Alexander's mother began to walk more slowly. His eyes seemed to see things through a new lens. Even the way she held her son changed, not more carefully but with more reverence. She knew deep down that she had touched the sky through him and touched the past itself with the hands of the soul. What Alexander had experienced, what he had brought back from the silence of near death, could no longer be ignored. Because this wasn't about a child, it was about a calling. Inside her, a process began to happen, something that had no name, but was real. As if a crack had opened in the hard soil of his memories, and a new root was forming there slowly, firmly. The name of it was forgiveness, but not that quick, verbal forgiveness said out of obligation. It was deep, silent forgiveness, which begins in the spirit and only then reaches the lips. She had carried too much weight for too long. Now I understood that hiding the pain was not protecting, it was prolonging the wound, and that God had chosen her son to free her, like a living letter sent from heaven. The father also changed, not with words, but with actions. He was the type of man who spoke little, who kept his emotions behind silence. But after everything that happened, something in him broke, or rather something in him opened. He began to pray more. He began to participate in services with a different perspective. Prayers stopped being ready-made sentences and became intimate conversations. He understood that if his son had been touched by something from above, he also needed to align himself with that presence, because the Spirit of God does not visit a house by chance. He enters to live, if there is space. And that father's heart, once hard, was now fertile soil. The grandmother in turn found peace in the things she had kept for so long. Mateo's memories stopped being pain and became memory. That black necklace, which once represented guilt and sadness, now rested on his open Bible as a symbol of liberation. She said softly, as she ran her fingers over the spent bills, "What God started, no one can stop," and smile. For the first time in many years, I smiled with a light heart, but perhaps the most beautiful change happened collectively, because that family, which previously walked automatically, now walked together. They sat down to pray before meals. They shared verses. They watched testimonies from other people who had gone through near-death experiences, trying to understand what kind of spiritual reality was behind it all. And above all, they made space to listen carefully to Alexander, not like someone listening to a child, but like someone listening to a message. He, in turn, did not behave like a little prophet, nor like someone special. He was just a boy. I ran, played, laughed, but there was a new depth to him. Sometimes he would stop out of nowhere, look up at the sky and smile, or he drew figures that no one understood, but which he said were forms of light. The family learned not to force it. He spoke when he needed to, and when he didn't speak, his presence still said a lot. One day his mother asked him if he remembered everything he had told her. He replied, "Some things, yes. Others, only the heart remembers." And she understood, because some revelations don't come back in words. They are tattooed on the soul, and they transform the way we see life. It was also during this period that they began receiving calls from distant relatives. Word of Alexander's experience had spread. Some wanted to understand. Others simply say thank you. An uncle who had been away for years appeared at the door with tears in his eyes, saying that the story had affected him. He said he also carried secrets and that he needed to talk about them. And right there in the room, a process of reconciliation began that no one expected. Because that's what happens when heaven touches earth through a child. The invisible barriers begin to fall. The silences begin to be broken. The sorrows, which previously seemed eternal, begin to lose strength. Because the truth, when it comes from God, does not come to accuse. She comes to free. And that's how the transformation happened. No screaming, no lights, no stage. Just with the constant presence of something bigger. Something that you don't see with your eyes, but you recognize with your soul. Something that many call a miracle. Others, on purpose. And that family now called it a new life. But the most surprising thing is that even after all this, everyone had the feeling that Alexander's mission was not over, that near-death experience was just the beginning of a greater calling. And because of that, everyone started to live more attentively, more sensitivity, like someone waiting, like someone who knows that God still has more to say. And you, who are here following all this, have you ever seen a family change completely after a miracle? Have you ever felt like hidden pain needed to come out for healing to come in? Have you ever experienced the power of a truth that frees not only those who speak, but also those who listen? If this part of the story touched your heart, comment below. The truth that heals comes from God. These words are not just engagement, they are seeds. Seeds of faith spread among everyone who feels that there is something bigger happening. If you've made it this far, it's because this story spoke to you in a different way. Maybe you felt something in your chest. Maybe a memory came back, or perhaps the voice of God has whispered in your heart, as a reminder that He still talks, and even uses little ones to reveal what was hidden. If this happened to you, don't ignore this touch. Subscribe to the channel right now, because here We bring real stories, in-depth accounts of near-death experiences, spiritual messages and testimonies that defy logic and touch the soul. And if you felt it, leave your like now. It is the sign that this message has reached you. What comes next carries something that many are not yet ready to hear, but you've come this far for a reason. Click on the next video that is appearing on the screen and continue this journey. There's something there waiting for you.